Comenius Plants Praefatio pro Oimion, the Greeks, Introduction to Theophrastus and Theophrastus's treatment of plant parts. Theophrastus was born in the city of Erissos on the island of Lesbos. He lived from about 371 to 287 BCE, a long life that spanned the much shorter one of Alexander the Great. In Athens, he was a student first of Plato at the Academy, and then a student and colleague and eventual successor to Aristotle at the Lyceum. As dictated in his will, he was buried in the Lyceum's botanical garden. He left us the most important botanical work from antiquity, Praefatio Historia de Historia Plantarum, Enquiry into Plants, as well as a work Praefatio Aition de Causis Plantarum, Causes of Plants. In the Enquiry, he identified about 500 plants. He learned about these from direct observation at the Lyceum garden, as well as from earlier writers, discussions with farmers, laborers, and herb gatherers, rhizotomoi, his own travels and reports from contemporaries, especially Alexander's returning veterans, who were bringing back Eastern exotica like the cotton plant, banyan, pepper, cinnamon, myrrh, and frankincense. Linnaeus honored Theophrastus with the epithet Parens Botanices. We're going to read some Greek passages from the Praefatio Historia, along with a Latin translation that has an interesting history. Theophrastus, like most Greek authors, was lost to the West after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. That changed when Theodore of Gaza arrived in Italy, one of the Greek refugees who fled to Italy as the Greek East was falling to the Turks. Gaza did a good job learning Latin, and he was commissioned by Pope Nicholas V to translate several works of Aristotle and Theophrastus, including the Praefatio Historia from a Greek manuscript recently acquired by the Vatican. This led to the Editio Princeps of Praefatio Historia in 1483, containing both the Greek text and Gaza's Latin translation. In the succeeding century, the eminent classicist Julius Caesar Scaliger, and later Robertus Constantinus, added well-regarded commentaries to Gaza's edition, and finally in 1644 in Amsterdam, about midpoint in Comenius's life, a Dutch physician, Johannes Bodius van Stapel, published the monumental edition of the Enquiry pictured here. It contains the Greek text, Gaza's Latin translation, the commentaries of Scaliger and Constantinus, an extensive new commentary by Bodius, and some pretty good woodcut illustrations. This was, of course, about the same time as Comenius utilized woodcuts for the Orbis Sensualium Pictus. It is Gaza's Latin we are using in the following slides. The first English translation of the Enquiry was done by Sir Arthur Hort for the Loeb edition in 1916. Both the Bodius edition and the Loeb edition are available on Google Books. Praefatio Historia is divided into 9 books. The first book is philosophical in nature and introduces the classification of plants into trees, shrubs, subshrubs, and herbs. The 2nd through 8th books are organized roughly according to this classification. Only the 9th book is about the topic that will come to more or less exclusively occupy the attention of botanical authors for many centuries to follow, the medicinal uses of plants. Theophrastus defines his subject matter and his approach at the beginning of Book 1. Ton puton tas diaporas, kai ten alen pusin lepteon katata mere kai topathe, kai tas geneses, kai tus bius, etegar kai praxes uk echusin hosper tas doia. The differences among plants, and their nature generally, must be undertaken in terms of their parts, their qualities, the ways in which their life originates, and the course which that life follows in each case. conduct and activities we do not find in plants as we do in animals. Plantarum differentias reliquamque naturam ex partibus affectionibus generationibus vitaque petere oportet. Mores enim et actiones, quam ad modum animalium genus minime plantae sortiuntur. Ton puton tas diaporas, plantarum differentias. The enquiry is an investigation into the differences between plants. Identifying plants by specifying their differences, their differential characters or diagnosis in the later terminology of botany, is common practice right up to today. Theophrastus is a philosopher. He assumes that among the diversity of plants there must be some order, some ordering principle. The Historia reports his findings. He begins by contrasting plants with animals. Animals have ethe kai praxes, mores et actiones. Plants don't. We skip the following paragraphs in which Theophrastus struggles to understand where analogies to animals work or break down. The methodology of his investigation into plants follows closely that of his mentor Aristotle's previously published inquiries about animals, ton peritasdoia historion, where Aristotle writes, haide diaporai ton sdoion esi katatetus bius, kai tas praxes, kai ta ete, kai ta moria, peri hon tupoemen epomen proton, hysteronda peri hekaston genos epistesantes erumen. Animals differ from one another in the course of their lives, in their actions, in their habits, and in their parts. Concerning these differences, we shall first speak in broad and general terms, and subsequently we shall treat of the same with close reference to each particular genus. Gaza also did the translation and editio princeps for Aristotle. Animalium vero differentias aut per vitas, aut per actiones, aut per mores, aut per partes constitui dignum est. Quibus de rebus primum formula quadam agendum, deinde generatem discussione diligentiore differendum censemus. The importance of Gaza to the humanist circles in Italy and in the transmission of Greek literature to us can be inferred by his presence in Botticelli's Adoration of the Magi. Theophrastus continues, Esi taimen kataten genesin kai ta pathe kai tus bius elte ore toterai kai hraeus, the difference in the way in which their life originates, in their qualities, and in the course of their lives, are more obvious and easy to understand. Sunt autem, quae per generationem affectionem vitamque sumi debent patentiora cognituque faciliora. Haide catata mere pleus equusi poikilias, but the differences shown in their parts present more complexity. Quae vero per partes noscantur necesses, varietates utique plures habere videmus. Autogar tuto proton uc hica nos ap oristae ta poia de mere cae me mere calen, al ecetina aporian. For this itself has not been satisfactorily determined, what ought and what ought not to be considered parts, and some difficulty is involved in making the distinction. Hoc enim ipsum primo non satis constat, quae partes, quaeque non partes debeant appellari, sed non nullam controversiam recipit. The philosopher confesses that he has an aporia. Theophrastus is not a dogmatist. He is willing to try out a proposition and then explore and acknowledge its pitfalls and limitations. but we'll skip over his aporia regarding what may justifiably be regarded as the parts of plants. He makes his choices, and we'll move straight to his names for and classification of those parts. By my count, Theophrastus names 16 universal parts of plants. These are the parts observation tells him are found in almost everything we call a plant. In the introduction to this Praefatio, I mentioned that for perspective on Theophrastus, I have relied heavily on Edward Lee Green's Landmarks monograph. Green is zealous in finding precedents in Theophrastus for developments in the study of plants that the modern era has tended to take credit for. His judgments may not always be right, but he provides a valuable introduction to Theophrastus and other early botanists. The deceptively simple sentences of Theophrastus that we are about to sample are, in Green's estimation, the result of years of deep study and, quote, constitute the most classic piece of elementary botany in existence. Esti de protamen kai megista kai koina ton pleston tada, risda, kaulos, ho epiton dendron kaletai stelikos, akramon, hon enioi kalusin osdon, klados. Now the primary and most important parts, which are also common to most plants, are these: root, stem, which in the case of trees is called trunk, branch, which is called by some bough, and twig. Partes primae maximae communesque plurimorum, radix, caulis, quem in arborum genere caudicem vocatare solemus, ramus, quem non nulli nodum appellant, circulus. And for your purposes in learning Greek vocabulary, please note Bodias's important note on klados. Klados can mean twig or bud, as here in Theophrastus, circulus in Latin, but more often it means branch, Latin ramus, for which Theophrastus chose the words akramon and ostos instead. By the way, a bit further in the text, Theophrastus concedes that his universal part definitions are tree-centric. This list of universal plant parts is almost poetically stark. After obvious deliberation, Theophrastus boiled down his list of ta mere, ta prota kai megista to the 4 durable, non-cyclical parts we call the vegetative parts. No mention yet of leaf, flower, fruit. Theophrastus is perfectly described, as Green observes, woody, deciduous plants in their winter leafless, flowerless, fruitless condition, the barest and arguably purest form of a plant one could come up with. Also note that the Greeks did not have, and Theophrastus does not try to invent, a specialized terminology. So he chooses the word kaulos to designate the universal part stem, but when speaking of a tree trunk, he will be content to use the word in everyday common usage, stelikos, and later, when discussing grasses and reeds and their stems, kalamos. Theophrastus is the first to undertake the anatomical as well as the morphological study of plants. From the 4 universal external parts, he now drills down to their constituent parts. Alada ex hon tauta, ploios, xulon, metra, hosa eke metran. Again, there are the things of which these universal external parts are composed, namely bark, wood, and in the case of those plants which have it, core. Sed sunt etiam alae quibus hae constant, cortex, lignum, matrix, ubi scilicet esse potest. And a definition of metra, which Sir Arthur Hort translates as core. Metra de to metaxu tu xulu, triton apo tu ploi hoion entois ostois muelos. Core is that which is found in the middle of the wood, being third in order and corresponding to the marrow in bones. Greeks and Romans counted inclusively, so core is third in order, counting the bark. Matrix, quod in medio ligni tertium accortice contenetur, velut medulla in ossibus. Calusi detines tuto cardian, oide enterionen. Enioide to entos tes metras autes cardian, oide muelon. Some call this part the heart, others call it heartwood. Some again call only the inner part of the core itself the heart, others marrow. Gaza shortens this to id non nulli cor alla e medullum appellant. This may be because the Greek text in the Loeb edition, which is what I am using, is not always the same as in the manuscript Gaza was translating. This pioneering examination of the internal structure of plants is one case, Green argues, where Theophrastus felt compelled to come up with a new term. Ploios, bark, and xulon, wood, like the names for the external parts, rhizda, kaulos, stelikos, kalamos, akramon, osdos, klados, are the common terms of everyman. But Theophrastus is penetrating plant anatomy here more deeply than everyman, and he has distinguished a third something, distinct from xulon, with a special role in the plant's growth. Some, by way of analogy to human anatomy, have called this cardia, or enterione, or muelos. But these terms don't satisfactorily capture for Theophrastus what he correctly believes to be the special growth function of this part in plants. So he borrows a word, matra. Matra in everyday language meant womb, but Theophrastus makes of it a specialized term. Equivalent terms in English for the hierarchy ploios, xulon, matra are sapwood, heartwood, and pith. What Theophrastus has discovered, presumably by doing cross-sections on still immature plants, was what we call living parenchyma. Parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma are the three types of ground tissue in plants. The words are coined from the Greek word enchyma, an infusion from enkeo, to pour in, to infuse, with the inference that this tissue is poured in to fill the space between cells. This is pretty impressive considering Theophrastus did not have the benefit of a microscope. The microscopic investigation of plant and animal tissue we do today is called histology, from Greek histos, stood upright, from histemi. In the context of the craft of weaving, histos meant the beam of an upright loom. From there, the warp fixed to the beam, and from there, the web itself, and thus the analogy to tissue. Closely related is the microscopic study of cells called cytology, from to kyutos, a Greek word for a hollowed-out jar or container. With his eyes for a microscope, Theophrastus penetrates one layer deeper. Kai ta tuton de etiprotera, kai ex hon tauta, hygron, is, plex, sarx, archaigar hautai. Further, there are the things which are even prior to these inner parts, and from which these inner parts are derived: sap, fiber, veins, flesh, for these are the elementary substances. Quaeque preores hisce habentur, quibusque istae consumuntur, humor, nervus, vena, caro, haec enim principia sunt. Everyday language had no words for the inner parts of plant anatomy, so Theophrastus had to borrow analogous terms from animal anatomy. Alla de ede hetera ton entos, ha katheauta menestin anonyma, diadaten homoioteta apekasdetai tois ton zdoion moriois. There are also other internal characters, which in themselves have no special name, but because of the resemblance are given names analogous to those of the parts of animals. Ad sunt vero et alia genera ab internis diversa, quae ipsa quidem per se nomine cadent, similitudine autem ex animalium partibus appellationem sibi mutuantur. And let me engage in a critique of Theodore of Gaza's translation here. He translates alla hetera ton entos as alia genera ab internis diversa. If I'm reading his Latin right, and if I can indulge in a little grammar, I think he's mistaking a genitive of possession, others of the internal parts, for a genitive of comparison, others that are different from the internal parts. I also don't know why Gaza says alia genera rather than aliae partes. But in any case, for the ancient peripatetics and natural philosophers, the concept of part was more complicated than you might think. A minute ago we read a sentence from Aristotle's Ton Peritas Doia Historion to illustrate how closely Theophrastus on plants models the approach of Aristotle on animals. Consider carefully the opening sentences of that work of Aristotle's. Ton entois zdois morion, tamenestin asynteta, hosa diaretai es homoio mere, hoion sarkes es sarkas. Of the parts of animals, also remember that Aristotle wrote a separate treaty, peri zdoion morion. Of the parts of animals, some are simple, that is, uncomposed, namely all such as divide into parts that are homoio mere, a cool Greek word without an English equivalent, but let's say parts uniform with themselves. Of the parts of animals, some are simple, namely all such as divide into parts uniform with themselves, such as flesh into flesh. Tada syntheta, hosa es an homoio mere, hoion hecer, uc es keras diaretai, udeto prosopon es prosopa. Other parts are composite, namely all such as divide into parts an homoio mere, not uniform with themselves, as for instance, the hand does not divide into hands, nor the face into faces. Ton de toiuton enia umonon mere, alakai mele kaletai. And of such as these, some are called not just parts, but limbs or members. Toiauta destin hosa ton meron hola onta hetera mere eke en hautois. Such are those parts that, while entire in themselves, have within themselves other diverse parts. Hoion kepale, kai skelos, kai ker, kai holos hobrakion, kai hothorax, as for instance the head, foot, hand, the arm as a whole, the chest. Tauta gar autata esti mere hola, kai estin auton hetera moria. For these are all themselves entire parts, and there are other diverse parts belonging to them. Pantade ta an homoio mere, syncetai ecton homoio meron, hoion ker exarchos kai neuron kai oston. And those parts that do not subdivide into parts uniform with themselves, how simple is the Greek, pantade ta an homoio mere, and those parts that do not subdivide into parts uniform with themselves are composed of parts that do divide into parts uniform with themselves, such as hand, composed of flesh and sinews and bones. If you read the beginning of Theophrastus on the parts of plants in its entirety, you'll see the same type of discussion. The creative Greek mind gave birth to both a rich poetic and a rich philosophical concept of part. The two Greek words Aristotle uses for part, ta morion and to meros, come from meromai, which means to receive one's portion or one's due. Liddell and Scott says morion means constituent part or member as opposed to meros, a mere part. The impersonal perfect passive of meromai, hemartai, means it is allotted, and homoros is fate, destiny, doom, death. Hemoira, the goddess of fate. To return to Theodore of Gaza, I don't know why he used the word genera instead of partes, which seems wrong to me. But then again, Theodore of Gaza knew much more of Greek, Aristotle, Theophrastus, and even Latin than I ever will. What think you? So far, we've excerpted Theophrastus's treatment of the universal vegetative parts, external and internal. Now he comes to what we call the reproductive parts of a plant. But for Theophrastus and the Greeks, who understood nothing of the reproductive organs and processes in plants, the operative distinction is that between parts that are durable and parts that are transient. And here, by the way, was his philosophical aporia regarding what should legitimately be considered the parts of plants. Since we don't regard the fetus of a pregnant animal as a part or member of that animal, like its arms or legs, should we, he pondered, consider the transient flower and fruit as parts of the plant? He decided yes. Alla destin hosper epetea mere ta prosten carpotokian, hoion pylon, anthos, miskos, tutto destin hoi syn ertetai pros to pyton to pylon kai ho carpos. Again, there are other, as it were, annual parts, epeteos from to etos, the yearly cycle. Again, there are other, as it were, annual parts which contribute to the production of the fruit, such as leaf, flower, stalk, and that part is the part by which the leaf and the fruit are attached to the plant. Quaedam vero quasi annuae partes accedunt, quae partui fructuum accommodantur, folium, flos, pediculus, quo folium e planta dependet et fructus. Gaza's word for the Greek miskos, stalk, pediculus, a diminutive of pes, pedis, foot, is used by Pliny for several parts separately distinguished in today's botany: pedicel or pedicle or pediculus, peduncle, petiole, petiolule. Eti de bruon hois huparche. Furthermore, moss in those plants that have it. Ad haec muscus, ubi scilicet esse potest. Moss is a legitimate example of a cyclical plant growth, though it doesn't strike us as a near universal plant part, and the text in the manuscripts here is uncertain. Kai epi passi sperma to tu carpu, and in all cases there is the seed of the fruit, super omnia semen fructus. Carpos desti to syncemenon sperma meta tu pericarpiu. By fruit is meant the seed or seeds together with the seed vessel. Est autem fructus quod carne et semena constat. The Greeks and Romans had plenty of words for specific kinds of seed vessels, such as our pod, husk, chaff, shell, and for succulent or fleshy coverings of seeds, like our pome, berry, etc. But Aristotle and Theophrastus wanted to abstract out the general concept, and they coined the word pericarpion. Pericarp is a word that endures in botany to this day. Theophrastus defines fruit, karpos, as the seed or seeds along with their pericarp. This is a pioneering definition, according to Green. For the common man then and now, fruit is the pericarp of fleshy fruit types, the thing we like to eat. But the proto-scientist Theophrastus came up with this more comprehensive definition that prevails in scientific botany today. For example, fruit in Simpson's Plant Systematics textbook is defined as the mature ovary of flowering plants consisting of the pericarp, or mature ovary wall, seeds, and, if present, accessory parts. And now we're going to get into the weeds a bit, so to speak. Like the Greeks, the everyday language of classical Latin had no generic term for seed vessel. Gaza translated Theophrastus's definition of fruit as fructus quod carne et semina constat. Fruit is that which consists of flesh and seed, carne et semina. This translation was roasted, so to speak, by the commentators in the 1644 Baudius edition of the Inquiry. Presumably by carne, flesh, Gaza had in mind the edible part of succulent fruits like the peach. But that misses the point. Theophrastus is striving for a universal definition of fruit, a point his commentators sharply noted. First, Scaliger. Theophrastus declarat fructum esse semen cum tegumento, quod pericarpion vocat. Nihil imprudentius a Theodoro, qui pericarpion carnem dixit. Theophrastus states that fruit is seed with a cover, which he calls pericarpion. Nothing is more ignorant than this from Theodorus, who calls pericarpion carnem. Nam quod fructus semina constant et tegumento vel osseo vel testaceo sine carne. Contemplare strobilum et conum cuparissanum et alia. For how many fruits are there that consist of a seed and a bony or hard covering without flesh? Consider the pine cone or cypress cone and other examples. Later, Baudius. Expone, fructus est quod involucro et semina constat. Baudius uses the generic term involucrum instead of tegumentum, and involucrum is another botanical Latin term that has worked its way into scientific plant descriptions today. Falsum enim est fructum omnem constare ex semina et carne, ipse Theophrastus, hoc eodem libro capitibus septimo decimo et duodecimo contrarium docet. Interpret it this way, that fruit consists of a wrapper and a seed, for it is false to say that every fruit consists of a seed and flesh. Theophrastus himself, later in this very same book, teaches the contrary. And in the passage Baudius cites, Theophrastus is discussing the differences in seeds among different plants. Ton men el theutosperma metato peri ekon, hoion poinikos, caruu, amygdales. The seed in some plants comes immediately inside the envelope. To peri ekon is the same as pericarpion, as in the date palm, the hazelnut, and the almond. Quorundam semen protenus post tegmen ambiens subest, ut palmae, nucis, amygdalae. Tonde metaxiu sarx kai pyrein, hosper elaas, kai cocumeleas, kai heteron. In some cases, in the middle between the envelope and the seed, there is flesh and a stone, as in the olive, the plum, and others. The Greek word for the stone or pit, holpyrein, has been passed down to us as pyrene, a synonym for the stone or pit in stone fruits, and technically defined as the hardened endocarp and the seed it surrounds. For this, botanists also use the Latinate term ossiculus. Quibustam caro et nucleus interiacent, ut oleae, pruni, aliorumque. Eniade kai en laboi, tad en humeni, tad en angeoi. Some seeds, again, are enclosed in a pod, some in a husk, some in a vessel. Tad kai gymnosperma teleos, and some seeds are without any cover whatsoever. We'll learn more about the modern classification gymnosperms later. Gaza's translation, quaedam etiam nuda patent in siliquis seems to mix the clear distinction Theophrastus makes between legumes and conifers, but it gives us in any case the Latin word for the pod in leguminous plants, siliqua. More importantly, as the commentators argue, Gaz's translation est autem fructus quod carne et semena constat misses the scope of Theophrastus's definition. Instead of carne, Gaza should have used tegumento or involucro, or simply Latinized the Peripatetics coinage pericarpion. So these are the universal plant parts, vegetative and reproductive, permanent and cyclical. But again, in Theophrastus, observation trumps rigid theory, and he acknowledges some parts are peculiar to particular plants. Para de tauta enion idia ata, kathaper hekekis druos, kai hehelix ampelu. Besides these, there are in some cases peculiar parts, such as the gall in the oak, or the tendril in the vine. Sunt praeterea quibustam propria quaedam ut robori gala et viti capreolus. Let's conclude. Near the beginning of Book 1, Theophrastus made this striking statement about his method and his appreciation of biodiversity. Holos de pollucun to puton, kai poikilon, kai kalapon epen katholu. In fact, your plant is a thing various and manifold, and so it is difficult to describe in universal terms. In tantum planta res varia est, atque multiplex, inque universum de earafere difficile. Ute gar hristan pant ecce, ute caulon, ute acremona, ute cladon, ute pylon, ute anthos, ute carpon, ut au ploion e metran e inas e plebas, hoion muces, hudnon. For not all the plants have, and you know these parts now, so I don't need to translate them again, for not all plants have all these parts, for instance, fungi and truffles. Neque enam radicem, neque caulum, neque ramum, neque germen, neque folium, neque florum, neque fructum plante omnes habere videntur. Cortex russus aut medulla, aut nervus, aut vena minime omnibus inest, ut in fungorum ac tuberum genere patet. And once again, in isolating fungi, Theophrastus pointed the way, for fungi continue to be a specially problematic life form for natural historians, and today we do not even classify fungi as plants. As Green put it, Peri Puton Historia is the very first synthesis in history of everything that vegetates, including even seaweeds and fungi, into one vast comprehensive assemblage of living entities called plants, ta puta. Unfortunately, this brilliant start went nowhere, and it took some 1700 years to try again.